Hi everybody. Well, it's another week and now we're going to look at complex noun phrases. So, uh, based on what you read in chapter 9, this stuff should be pretty straightforward. We have the noun, the head noun. I think I was calling it noun head sometimes. I get a little dyslexic, but it can have pre-modifiers and post-modifiers. The pre-modifiers also include determiners, and the post-modifiers include prepositional phrases and a few other things. Let's take a look. So, pre-modifiers, you can have adjectives like a special project, an internal memo. Participial pre-modifiers, written reasons, received goods, detecting devices, so things like that. And then also we have nouns as pre-modifiers. And this is one of the things I know we've talked about in class. Do we really consider it an adjective? Well, it's certainly acting like an adjective. All of these are because they're modifying nouns. But they're all just a little bit different. Now, let's look at post-modifiers. First, we're going to look at phrases that can be post-modifiers. One of the most common is the prepositional phrase. Compensation for emotional damage is modifying the head noun compensation. And then you can also have appositive noun phrases, which is just a restatement of whatever that noun is. The Indian captain, Muhammad Azharuddin. You can also have adjective phrases that are not very common, but it does happen. So here we have the example, the extremely short duration varieties common in India were not used in Africa. I mean, it does occur, but they're not as common as the others. And now we're going to look at the ones that I really want us to pay attention to, and that is looking at the post-modifiers that are clauses. We've got the that clauses, or relative clauses really, to infinitive, ing clauses, and ed clauses. So notice these are all things that we were talking about last week when we're looking at different clauses. Notice too that first one, the relative clauses, are finite. And all these other ones are non-finite. Remember, non-finite means there's no tense, there's no modality. Okay? We also can have adverbs acting as noun modifiers. The nearby guards, a block behind, so they happen. And to tell you the truth, again, just like when we were looking at with the participles and the nouns acting in the role of adjectives, it really, if you look at this, how would you really want to talk to your students about calling this an adverb? I don't think so. I think you should just consider it an adjective. But they do make the point in our book that they're adverbs. Now let's talk about relative clauses. We went over this a little bit in class, but I want to go over it again because I do think this is one of those things that it's really good to have a strong sense of what's going on here. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. My brother, who's a teacher, lives in Boston. My sister, who's a registrar, lives in Milwaukee. Both of these sentences have a relative clause, who's a teacher and who's a registrar. But there's a little bit of a difference here. And if you think about it, when you look at this, you may think that I'm an artist. Maybe I've got more than one brother. And this right here, I've got 3 brothers. It's identifying one of those people. So we're saying, okay, it's not the guy in Connecticut, it's not the guy in Seattle, whatever. But now we have my sister, who's a registrar. This is just extra information. And the assumption here is, well, I've only got one sister, or one sister I'm interested in talking about. So this is what we look at when we talk about restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. One of the things that's confusing about this is that you will have other phrases. Sometimes some grammar books will call them identifying and non-identifying. defining and non-defining. All of those are terms you're going to see if you look at different grammar books. But the key element here is that this is a necessary part of the understanding the idea here. This is not. You can just say, my sister lives in Milwaukee, and really you've just added a little extra information. Whereas here, as a writer or a speaker, I'm saying you need to know this information to understand which brother I'm talking about. So, restrictive clauses identify the reference of the head noun. There are several cars, but we're concerned about the car that was going past, not the car that was parked. Non-restrictive relative clauses just add extra information. He looked into her mailbox, and you could just stop and leave this off if you wanted because you still understand that. But you wanted to give her a little extra information. And in writing, as we mentioned in class, non-restrictive relative clauses are separated from the head noun by a comma, while no punctuation is used with the restrictive relative clause or any of the other postmodifiers. And when we're speaking, typically we give a little bit of a pause when we are using the non-restrictive. Sort of the pause equals a comma in some senses. So you can have other postmodifiers that can be either restrictive or non-restrictive. And they can be things like the ed clause, the ing clause, prepositional phrases, and appositives. And here are some examples of restrictive postmodifiers that are not relative clauses. When you say, his is a fury fanned by insensitive press coverage of homosexuality and the AIDS epidemic, all of this is telling us maybe he's a very angry guy, so he's got other furies. You're telling us this is the fury that we're really worried about. The same thing here. Advancing rapidly is modifying the rebels, and it's defining which rebels we're talking about. We're not talking about all doctors when we have this prepositional phrase. We are talking about the doctors at Johns Hopkins. And then in the last one here, and you can also have them non-restricted. You just said he cannot pronounce the word. This is not as common for most. That's very different than saying he cannot pronounce the word. And that's just where you're giving extra information, but you're using this structure. And notice for all of these, there is a comma. And that sort of tells us, and notice there's a comma that also marks the end of the thing. And one of the other things that you can do, and this is really only with the appositives, is that you can have parentheses as well. Okay, so now we're going to focus again. I just want to remind you about the issues of relative clauses. The three key components are the head noun, the relativizer, and the gap. And remember, the gap is what's missing. It's what is missing in the clause, the relative clause. It's not missing in the entire sentence because it actually corresponds to the head noun. And here are those examples that we talked about. The earrings that Mama wore. What's missing is, if you just look at Mama wore, that doesn't really mean anything. So the gap here is the earrings. Now, especially for native speakers, when you look at this sentence, it's very easy to process, or look at this noun phrase, it's very easy to process the earrings that Mama wore. But it's not necessarily as easy for someone who's learning the language. And again, here, the gap there is the direct object because earrings have been removed here. And the man who stole the earrings, notice now if we look at what comes after who, it's just stole the earrings. We have no subject, so there's a subject gap. There's also something called the zero relativizer. When there is an object gap, you can get rid of this. And you can just say the earrings that Mama wore or the earrings Mama wore. That's also a real challenge for learners because they're like, well, do I use it or I don't use it? You know, what's the rule? And it's one of those things that's optional. but it's optional only for the direct object gap, which can be very frustrating because then you have to make sure you understand that. So, the relativizers include 8 different items, 5 relative pronouns and 3 relative adverbs. Relative pronouns are replacing a noun phrase. A boy that no one knew, that replaces the direct object. No one knew the boy. And relative adverbs are substituting for adverbial phrases. The store where I bought it is I bought it where? At the store. So here are some examples that I want you to try out for me. And if you're hungry, I apologize because I'm using pizza examples. I want you to see if you can identify the noun phrase that contains a relative clause. Look, identify the noun head. I did it again. Or maybe it's supposed to be the head noun. Oh, they're driving me crazy. And the relative clause. And also, what's the gap? Now, if you want, you can pause this and try and figure it out. And then you can start up again, and I'm going to talk through it. So here's what I'm thinking about here. When we have the sentence, the restaurant where I usually have pizza went out of business. Really, one of the things you want to look at first is what's your subject and what's your verb in the sentence. And let's just say the main idea is the restaurant went out of business, right? So here we have this relative clause, and it is describing the restaurant. So that's our noun. I think I'm actually going to call it a head noun, not a noun head. All right. So the head noun is modified by this, where I usually have pizza. Now you have to look at this and say, okay, well, this looks like a good sentence. I usually have pizza. But the gap, there is a gap there, but it's the adverbial. And it's where? And it's at the restaurant or in the restaurant. So that's the gap. Okay, I went to my brother's house where he makes his own pizza. So now, this is pretty easy. Subject, verb, I went to my brother's house. That's our adverbial. And now we're going to say, well, here we have something with where he makes his own pizza. This looks similar to here because we got the same word, where. It's modifying this right here, house. And typically, the relative clause is going to come directly after the noun it's modifying. It doesn't always happen, but typically it will. So we've got a subject, we've got our verb, we've got our object. All's good. So again, we're missing the where. So we're missing the adverbial. Let me make it. Okay. This one, I ate the pizza that was in the refrigerator. Subject, verb, object. And that was in the refrigerator. Well, that tells us what is it modifying? The noun pizza. And now if you look at just this part of it, was in the refrigerator, what is missing? The subject. So that's the gap is the subject. It's a subject relative clause. I really enjoyed the pizza that I ate. Again, we've got our subject, verb, and now we've got our part of our direct object, we have this little clause, that I ate. That's our relative clause. Is it describing me? No, but it is describing the pizza. And then you look at this, I ate. Well, that actually, I eat, I ate. You can use that as a noun, the valency of eat could work that way. But we actually know that we're looking at it as a monotransitive, and it is we're missing the object, which is pizza. I ate pizza. So it's the gap there is the direct object. However, that pizza I ate kept me up all night. Now here we've got to find where is our relative clause. That pizza that I ate kept me up all night. Now one of the things that people might do, what students might do especially, is they say, oh, here's that. So maybe there's something, that pizza did something, right? But that is a confusing word because it has so many different uses. It's actually a determiner. Instead of this pizza, it's that pizza. And then, and notice here, our poor students are seeing verb, what the heck? Help us. This is now our relative clause, the pizza I ate. So notice this is a zero, the zero relativizer, because we removed the word that. And that pizza that I ate, sometimes if you have this word here, you may not want to use it again, just aesthetically. So this whole thing is our subject, and there's our verb. So that's why the two verbs are together. That's not always an easy concept for people to understand. So notice now, though, but I ate pizza. So it's the same thing. It's an object relative clause. There's a zero relativizer. And now I'm going to move on so you can see it without all my marking. And that's what we have. Hopefully you agree with those. Now I want to turn to something a little bit different. And I want you to look at some examples here and see what's going on with each one of these based on what we know now about relative clauses, and think about what is going on, and then how you would actually address it with students. You can pause this for a minute and take a look at them, and then I'm going to walk through a little bit, just briefly with them. All right, let's take a look here. Number one, the man who was sitting next to me, he had black hair. Now, when we speak, that actually makes a lot of sense, because you might say, well, you see that man, the man who was sitting next to me, he had black hair. Repeating a subject is actually very common in spoken language. But notice here, if we're looking at writing, we have to determine what is our subject. Is it he, or is it this whole phrase? So here we got one subject and then we have another subject, and we're repeating the subject, and that's something that we don't want to do. But when you're listening to people speak, this is very common. So this is more of an issue of somebody who's learning the language and they do a lot of talking and a lot of listening, but they're not doing a lot of reading and writing. They may think, well, that's perfectly fine when I speak, so why not when I talk? Let's look at number two. The book what I bought was by Edward Lear. And the problem here is the word what. And as you may know, you can use that. You could also use which, and there's some nice information in our book that talks to you about the distinction between that and which, so you should look at that. So and again, maybe somebody might use that in some dialects, but typically you're not going to be using that. So it's the book that I bought. What can be confusing for learners is because you can use what I bought was a book by Edward Lear. So you can use this by itself to create a noun phrase. Well, yeah, it's acting like a noun phrase. But it's not the right word if we're going to make it into the relative clause. He lent me the book, which I found it very useful. This one to me I find happens a lot in the writing that I look at. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because remember, we're always saying, oh, you need your subject, your verb, your object. Good, why am I going to leave this off? I'm missing something. That's where it requires making sure that people realize that, the which is referring to book, and you then don't repeat it here. So that's something that a lot of learners will have trouble with at certain points as they're developing proficiency. The winner, that was 25, will receive $14,000. Here it's just a matter of animate versus inanimate objects in the non-restrictive relative clauses. And finally, our office is about 2 miles from the center, which I share with my 2 colleagues. Again, when we're speaking, we might say that. Our office is about 2 miles from the center, which I share with my colleague. You might be able to get away with that. But what's going on here is that this is really modifying that. It's not modifying the center. But because it's directly after the center, that is the understanding that someone would take away from that. All right, well, I just wanted you to try to start making connections between the things that we're looking at and how people might make mistakes, and how you might then address those issues. So, for next week, complete the short exercises and quiz that I'll post for you online here. I apologize about our discussion board. I've been having trouble with that, so try to post at least one comment, response, or question in the discussion board. I think I may end up going back to the original discussion groups, although I think I'm going to keep you in the smaller groups in class. I'll get to know more people anyway. Remember, exercise 2 is due next Tuesday. Email me if you have any questions. And I want you to start looking at chapter 10. You don't worry about actually getting it all done, because we'll actually do that next week, and looking at the workbook. And finally, though, I want you to choose a partner for the final grammar project, and email me, and I'll set you up with someone. And start talking to them if you have figured out who you're going to do it with, to figure out what are the 2 areas that you want to focus on. All right, everybody. See you soon.